Okay. Hi, should we do like speaker order name introductions, I guess? Perfect. I'm Shreya. I'll be first gov and third gov.
And I'm Ollie. I'll be second gov.
Yeah, I'm Austin. I will be first and third op.
And I'm Sam. I will be speaking second on the app.
Great. I'll take verbal POIs if everyone's all right with that, and I also use she, her pronouns, so great. Motion, this House believes that Brazil should prioritize relations with China over the USA, and Dalton RF is on the affirmative. If everybody is ready, great. Then my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. We think that in the oh wait, that's not the right timer. Sorry. If everybody is ready, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. We think that in the status quo, something isn't working for Brazil, and that means that something has got to give and something has got to change. I couldn't be prouder to affirm. What's the speech going to look like? First, an overview of the definitions, the framework, and then 3 independent contentions. Let's start off with the top of case. Really simple. We're just going to define this House to be the current leader of Brazil. This is a policy motion. They're the ones with the actual agency and ability to enact this policy. So that's who we're going to say is this House. That's the deciding agent. Then, what's the framework? We think that importantly, the main thing that this round basically comes down to is who can make Brazil stronger and safer on an economic and material basis. Reason for this is kind of a link chain that tourism is a really big part of Brazil's economy, and a strong economy also is a strong platform as a country. But you need people to come to Brazil to engage in tourism, and in the status quo, Brazil is not safe. So people don't come because they're warned not to come because of the high rates of violence and crime violence. We think that you need your country to be safe in order to actually be stable, in order to actually have proper relations in the government. Yeah.
Yeah, is this a contention? What is this?
Okay, I'm gonna pause time. This is the framework and the reasoning for the framework.
Wait, and what exactly was the framework again?
It's like which side can basically make Brazil safer.
Okay.
Okay, great. I have 1 minute, 5 seconds on the clock. My time will resume in 3, 2, 1. As I was saying, we think that whichever side can prove that they make Brazil safer should therefore win the round, since they're doing what's best for Brazil overall by being able to strengthen not only the economy, but also the physical safety of the people there. We think that as the leader of Brazil, you're incentivized to want to do this. We think that's what you should be evaluating the round under, which side can make Brazil the most safe in order to make Brazil essentially the best country that it can be, the best version of itself that it can be. With that, let's get into 3 independent contentions. Firstly, on illicit affairs. We think that in the status quo, as I said under the framing, Brazil has a really high crime rate. There's lots of gang violence. There's just lots of violence in general. Tourists are warned not to come to Brazil due to this violence, and it's currently just not a very safe country in general. We think that this is bad for Brazil for reasons outlined above. Tourism is important to its economy, but also when a country is not safe, it means that people disregard it and write it off. It means that it's not going to be viewed as powerful in the status quo. That's not good for Brazil either. And it's also just really in general decreasing the quality of life of the people who live there, bad for Brazilians as a whole. So how do we think we solve this on-site government? We think that when you ally with China, you're able to do one really important thing for Brazil, which is a really hard crackdown on crime. Think about what's happening in El Salvador, where they have this kind of authoritarian style crackdown on crime that has reduced their crime rate to the lowest, I'm pretty sure, in Central and South America, where before it was one of the highest in the world. That style crackdown is not something that's going to be supported by the US because of how it's less commonly seen in modern democracies or Western democracies. And it's kind of considered, not as palatable for these democracies. The US is very unlikely to actually allocate resources and support for this style crackdown. And in that method, we don't think that Brazil is actually going to be getting any safer in the status quo, any safer in the opposition world. We think that uniquely, when you have solvency for this issue of the safety, you are saving many lives in Brazil, but you are also just improving the quality of the country as a whole. If you were able to get resources to clean up Brazil, you can therefore be helping Brazil. We think you could only do that on the government side of this debate. So then, let's move on to our second contention about the economic boom. We think that in general right now, Brazil doesn't have the best economy, but that isn't because they don't have the resources to be able to have that economy. Brazil has an abundance of natural resources. Brazil is home to the Amazon rainforest, which brings in a lot of tourism. We think that, do you have a POI? Sorry.
Yeah. What constitutes as having a large economy if having the 7th largest economy in the world doesn't count?
We think that like stability of the economy is important, sorry. And basically what we're saying is that Brazil is able to be more economically stable when they're allied with China as opposed to the United States. Why is this? Firstly, we think that China's like kind of model of the we think that China's model of government intervention is a little bit better suited towards Brazil's style of how they're like dependent on the economy. That's tourism is the like one of the biggest industries in Brazil, which is kind of regulated through the government. In that sense, we think that when you have the government able to be making sure that the economy is strong through influencing tourism, making sure that tourism is strong, you're going to be able to modulate and regulate better than when you have a breakdown of private companies controlling tourism in Brazil, and they're likely not even going to be headquartered in Brazil. So we don't think that Brazil is going to be able to see these benefits that, Western countries do, like the US. We don't think that that economic model is as well applicable to Brazil, and therefore this isn't going to be as good for them. But more than that, we think also that China is going to be more willing to give Brazil resources to build infrastructure in this scenario than the US. We've seen that they're more likely to actually just give out loans to smaller countries. And the opposition might get up here and tell you that these loans come at a big price, but we think that Brazil, with the 7th largest economy in the world, as they have said, is going to be able to be a little bit stronger than the small countries that China can bully around, be able to take these loans and actually use them for good things instead of just getting bullied as much. But we think importantly, they're going to be more economically stable when they ally with China, and that's a really big thing for them. Then, onto our third, and we think most important contention about competition. We think that importantly, prioritizing China makes the US more incentivized to pursue a relationship with Brazil anyways. And we think that, firstly, there's two parts to this. Firstly, we think that China is more likely than the US in the first place to engage in relationships with Brazil at all. The US doesn't really have a huge reason to pay special attention to Brazil in the status quo because they're already they already have international relations with the US. They are already kind of default prioritizing them. And we think that this model comes into the idea that the US is the world's hegemon. Like they are the global seat of power. And therefore, when you have international relations with the US, it's kind of a de facto assumption on their part that they expect to be the most prioritized actor in your international relationships, in your international frame. So that being said, if you were Brazil and you prioritize the US at the highest, which you're probably already doing, it doesn't actually give you any special attention because A, we think that's already the status quo, but B, even if it isn't, that's just what the US expects. You're kind of just meeting the bare minimum there. They're not likely to actually give you any special attention, any special aid from this that is going to be able to help you to the point that the delta is that China, on the other hand, is more likely to engage with diplomatic relations with Brazil because they aren't currently being prioritized over the US. Why is this important? We think that in order to actually enact anything about safety, about the economy, about making Brazil stronger and a better and a safer place, you actually need engagement with the ally that you're trying to pursue relations with. To the point at which the probability is always on-side government of having a stronger relationship with China, to the point at which the probability of China reciprocating your interest is going to be higher than the United States, we think you're automatically voting government on this ballot. But also, we think that we uniquely can also get the benefits of side opposition on the government side of the House, because in the government side of the House, we're more likely to be getting the United States' attention as a whole. Why is this? We think that the US places importance in what China does, but China doesn't really go around recruiting US allies out of nowhere because of the established Western hegemony. So when we think that we see Brazil trying to engage in diplomatic relations with China, the US is going to go back. They're going to be like, hey, we're going to lose one of our allies. We should go in and make sure that we support them so they stay with us. So Brazil is more likely to get twice the amount of attention and twice the amount of support in a government world. Think about if you were talking with your crush and they're only paying attention to you and you would feel super good, but then all of a sudden they go around talking to other people and they're talking to other girls and you would just feel bad. So then you would be more likely to go and pay extra attention to them so that they would like you back. We think that the same kind of logic applies for international countries, and we think that for all these reasons and more, you should be voting for the government. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Echo. All right. Is everybody ready? Okay, then I will start my time now. Let's start on the top of case. They make a bunch of false characterizations here. Firstly is on the idea that Brazil isn't going great. This is objectively not true. As Sam mentions in a POI, they have the 7th largest economy in the world. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Brazil is doing excellently. Now onto their framework. We have a few responses here. First one is on the idea that tourism is this huge facet of Brazil's economy, because this is completely wrong and it flows into their entire case. Brazil's economy does have tourism, but it is by far a manufacturing economy. It is one of the largest manufacturers in the entire world. It is built on steel, automobiles, and airplanes. The economy of Brazil is centered on manufacturing. That's why they're so successful, because they have a multi-hundred million people population, which allows them to become a massive manufacturing economy. It's not just based on tourism. That's wrong. Then on the framework here of the idea of it about being like what's safest for Brazil. First of all, we think that a better economy matters too, and a better economy probably matters more. If everybody is super safe, but everybody is also super poor, that's pretty bad. We also think that having a better economy necessarily means a safer country. That's just like a correlation that shows up across the world. We think we should just be focusing on what is best for Brazil, what's best for their economy, what's best for their safety. There's no reason to prioritize safety above anything else that's going to come up in this debate. Now on to op case. Firstly, an overview. We want to note the fact that China is the #2 power in the world. They are solidly #2, but they are very solidly not #1. The United States has 6 times the military budget, a far larger economy, a far higher GDP per capita, and they are the #1 power in the world. With that said, let's get onto the first opposition contention, which is on economics. Our first subpoint here is on loans and infrastructure. Each of the United States and China has a program for infrastructure development in like nations that they're actually friendly with. The United States' G7 initiative is super successful in doing this, of giving out loans for infrastructure. The BRI, China's program for the same thing, on the other hand, is unbelievably predatory. What they do is they give you a bunch of money. They say, here, go build a bunch of boats. And then they say 10 years later, hey, that was a loan, so we're going to take all of your boats. And now these countries are losing a huge amount of money trying to pay off these massive high interest loans to China. It's unbelievably predatory. But when you partner with the US and the G7, they do the same thing, but they don't do it in an incredibly predatory way. Why? Because the US has a natural incentive to take long-term investment in countries because they are the dominant power in the world. What China wants to do right now is do short-term things that make them a lot of money and destroy their relationships because they're trying to disturb the status quo and make themselves the #1 power in the short term, whereas the US is investing in the long term because they're already the #1 power. Brazil is built on manufacturing, and therefore they need infrastructure loans, and the US is the best country to provide them. Secondly, on economics is free trade. Brazil has a really large economy, and so free trade is really, really important. Every other large economy in the world does it to an incredible degree. And the United States' main economic relationship policy is they open up trade relations, including, importantly, with manufacturing in the United States. One second. And the United States wants to make nations a part of the globalized economy because in the status quo, the United States runs the global economy, so it's good for them for more people to be involved in it. Yes.
Sorry, do you think that China or the US is like more of a manufacturing economy?
I mean, obviously, like China themselves is like a larger manufacturing economy, but I don't really see what that has to do with any of this. What we're explaining is that the US is better for providing loans directly for manufacturing. Continuing on free trade, as we've just clearly explained, the United States wants to make nations part of the globalized economy, but China, because they are #2 and not #1 in that global economy, want to make sure that countries are solely reliant on China and rather than being part of the global economy. But being part of the global economy is obviously better because free trade is good for nations. It allows them to build up their economy, and it's been seen throughout the course of like geopolitical history that free trade nations do better in the long run. That's why it's the overwhelmingly popular policy in basically every major economy in the world. Second contention is on geopolitics. Firstly, on their relationship with Europe. The United States is obviously incredibly closely aligned with Europe, and Europe obviously hates China. We think that if Brazil opens up to the United States more than they open up to China, European countries are going to take a greater interest in their relationship with Brazil. This is good for Brazil. European countries are incredibly powerful and have a lot of economic power. And we can look at examples like Pakistan, who've become increasingly close with China and then been cut off from the global economy by the United States and Europe. That would be really, really bad for Brazil. Second is on Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. They're not part of Europe, but they're also all incredibly important. And if you partner with China, they're incredibly threatened by China because they are so nearby, and China has shown this gravitation towards military attacks on nearby nations. We think that if Brazil works with China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, who are all incredibly large players in the global economy, are never going to want to trade with them. That's also bad for Brazil. But the third contention out of side op is on military. We think that if Brazil ends up in trouble because of a war in South America, the United States is way, way better equipped to help them because that's what they've done across the world for decades, is help countries in wars. We can also look to the fact that if the United States and China enter a war in Taiwan, for example, Brazil would obviously want to be on the United States States' side. Obviously, that war would be really, really far away, but the US could easily hurt you economically because you're supporting China during wartime. We can look at the Cold War, for example, where the United States actively seek to economically punish countries that were partnered with Russia, and Brazil would see the exact same attacks on them if they were partnered with China. Now on to the government case. Their first contention on high crime rate is utterly ridiculous, and I hate to say it that way, but that's actually what it is. They give you this example of El Salvador's crime crackdown and say that that's a great example, but what they totally fail to recognize is that Bukele and the crackdown that he's created in El Salvador, Bukele is the president of El Salvador, by the way, is unbelievably popular in the United States, and they have shown broad support for it because of how successful it's been. Tough on crime policies are getting more and more and more popular in the United States. That's like a huge part of what both candidates are running on right now. Kamala's a prosecutor, and Trump is obviously a big tough on crime guy. People in the United States want to be tough on crime, and nobody's going to be angry at Brazil in either world for cracking down on crime. And either way, if you're prioritizing relationships with the United States and giving them something economically, they're not going to call you out on your crime policy because they want to keep having a good relationship with you economically. You can also look to our military contention because in any time of war, Brazil would be far safer if partnered with the US. Crime rates will go down or go up no matter who you pick here, but you'll be safer in a military situation if you partner with the US. Second is onto this idea of the economic boom. And the biggest problem with this contention is that it relies on the completely false idea that Brazil's economy is fully based on tourism, because it's not. Brazil is a massive nation with a massive population and like one of the largest manufacturing and steel industries in the entire world. And this idea that Brazil is like struggling in everything is just like some blatant stereotype of all like Latin American countries that often comes out of the United States, but it isn't true. Just because China's model of government intervention is better suited to Brazil because of tourism, that doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter if the governmental strategies line up, because as we've shown you in our case, the US is actually better equipped to help Brazil economically and to get them involved in free trade, which is super important for manufacturing nations, because manufacturing doesn't matter if you don't have anything to sell people that you manufacture to. This is really important. Third, on their contention of competition, we think this is ridiculous. The logic of crushes doesn't work because the United States obviously does not have a crush on Brazil. Throughout history, when the US sees people partnering with their allies, there's two ways to get what you want in this world. There's the carrot and the stick, and the US always chooses the stick. Look to the Cold War example that we gave you earlier. When nations partnered with Russia instead of the United States, the US didn't go and give them flowers, they killed them. This is what the United States does. Obviously, they're not going to attack Brazil militarily, but if they partner with China, the US is just going to punish them economically in every possible way that they can. Then we can also note the fact that the motion says that you're prioritizing China over the United States. So even if the US wanted Brazil to work with them by Gov's advocacy, you would have to pick China over the United States. So they can't possibly get any offense out of this contention, even if it's true. But more importantly, it's just obviously not. Insofar as we've shown you a strong case which will prove to you that both economically and politically Brazil is better off working with the US than China, it should be a clear opt ballot. Thank you.
Okay, is everybody ready? All right. Then are you guys fine with a quick off-time roadmap? All right, I will just be going top of case, our case, and then or their case, then our case. So I will start my time now. Okay, on this quick observation that like Austin gives you that China is quote unquote like blatantly the #2 power in the world, and he gives you all these statistics about, oh, US's military budget is higher, they have a larger economy and they're a larger power. Like, sure, you can bring up these stats that like China is #2 in these specific things, but there are also other things that they're more effective at than the US. One that comes to mind immediately is that China's approval rate has actually just passed the US's approval rate globally. So they're actually viewed in terms of economic or foreign relations as a higher power or a better power than the United States is. And then we also tell you, I'd want to extend the thing that Shreya tells you at the very beginning of her speech, which is that something does have to change in Brazil. And as much as the opposition refuses to acknowledge it, sure, they have the 7th largest economy in the world, pure raw numbers. Sure that they have like a growing economy, but like the fact of the matter is that like Brazil is not as stable as the opposition makes them out to be. And they talk about this whole framework and they tell you that #1, tourism isn't a huge facet of Brazil's economy, and it's by far a manufacturing economy. My response to this is like, so what, right? We say that even if you don't buy our tourism point, China's more likely to help with manufacturing because number one, they are the greatest manufacturing country in the world. Number two, they care much less about the climate than the United States does. So even if you buy the fact that like opposition's like telling you that Brazil's a huge manufacturing economy, we tell you that China is still more equipped to help them, number one. And number two, they're much more willing to help them. But now they talk about our framework and they tell you like what is safest. Does a better economy matter more? They tell you that like better economy means a safer country. So there's no reason to prioritize safety. We tell you like, sure, we think a more stable economy is, matters a lot. We tell you that if an economy is big, but like still a lot of people are struggling down low at the bottom stratas of society, that may not matter as much. But we do agree with what they tell you about the fact that like a stable economy does mean a safer country. But we would also say that like a lower crime rate has a higher is a safer country as well. And like they try to tell you all these things about, oh, Brazil is doing great, but they also fail to mention that Brazil's crime rate is extremely high and there is an extreme amount of crime in the country. And they try to paint this entire debate around the fact that Brazil is doing great right now, when the fact of the matter is that's not actually the case. So I now want to go into the opposition's contention. Their first contention is on economics, and they tell you that number one, the G7 initiative is super successful, and they respond and say BRI is predatory, and the US actually has a natural incentive to help. This is number one, this is just false. Like G7 is also predatory. The US expects things, they just expect them in different ways than China does. There's no reason, if you think about it logically from a self-interested perspective, that the United States is going to go into a country and just help from them for the sake of that country. The US wants to maintain its power. It has an incentive to do that, so they want things in return if they're, allied with Brazil. Secondly, Shreya brilliantly tells you in PMC that because Brazil's economy is large in the status quo, they're not able to be bullied like some of the other smaller countries that China interacts with. And they give this whole example of the Belt and Road Initiative, but Brazil is not in the case as so many of these other countries because they are larger, because they are more recognized globally. So don't buy this whole free trade point and the like China abusing the Brazil's resources and abusing the country. Now, I want to get back to this whole free trade point one more time. And I want to tell you, number one, that China, again, is way more likely to help with manufacturing. But number two, the US wanting free trade doesn't even matter if you buy our C3, where we tell you that insofar as Brazil does not show interest in China, the US is not actually going to care to prioritize them. So they're not going to focus on Brazil. I'll get more into their refutations on that when I go to our case. But now I want to go into their second contention on geopolitics. They tell you that Brazil opening up to the United States more than China means that Europe is going to help Brazil. What Austin fails to acknowledge is that they are arguing for the status quo. Why isn't Brazil helping in the why isn't Europe helping in the status quo right now? Brazil prefers the US over China in the status quo. Why don't we see these impacts of Europe helping so much materializing right now? Now, they tell you, they give these examples of like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. They tell you that these are important to the economy and that they're threatened by China. And partnering with China throws off Brazil from all these other countries. Number one, I would say that if these countries are threatened by China, they aren't going to do anything to harm Brazil because China is a threat to them. There is this aspect of fear-mongering that exists, that they're not going to do anything to China. And by that logic, like, it extends to Brazil if Brazil is allied with China. So like, don't really buy this contention at all. Now, on their third contention about military, they tell you that if Brazil ends up in trouble, the US is better equipped to help them. I would give you a couple examples here. Look at the Taliban, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. There have been so many US interventions that have turned out badly because they fly in blind oftentimes with the military. The opposition's entire military argument rests on the premise that because the US has the largest military in the world, it's therefore the most effective at solving problems, when that's not actually the case. So the US would also, then they talk about this whole point about fear-mongering if the US sides with China. The US would rather get Brazil back than fear-monger, but even if they don't, like, China is still going to help Brazil out because they see themselves in competition with the United States. Moving on to our case. On our first contention on illicit affairs, they talk about El Salvador, and they talk about tough on crime rising in the United States. What we would say first to this is that El Salvador's crackdown on crime is that tough on crime in the United States is fundamentally different from what Brazil is doing. And, like, also what El Salvador's president is doing, and also what he's doing isn't actually popular, sorry, in the United States, even as the opposition tries to assert that. But a second response here, even then, we think that the US is still less likely to send aid for this point. They missed the analysis entirely. We don't think that Brazil is needed by the US in the same way. That's important because if the US sends aid to Brazil, it's only for things that help them. But there's less things that can help the United States because they have more than China already in terms of like what everything that the opposition gives you. And Brazil's crime rate is not connected to US power. So really no money is going to like go into fighting crime there. Now on this whole point about that they try to give you about war being safer with the US, I respond to this on their case, but not right now. I'm almost in protected time, but not right now. On this whole point about war being safer in the United States, that's not actually true. It's unlikely that the US actually goes to war for Brazil and sends in troops, but we also think that China and their allies are equally likely to send weapons to Brazil as the US would be, and there isn't really any warranting as to why it's not. China needs Brazil more than the United States does by ops' own analysis that they give you. So flow that through. So they're way more likely to actually help them. Incentive analysis matters a lot in this debate. Now, on this point about the economic boom, we would say that on the responses to tourism, number one, economic stability is as important as something like a country's GDP. So don't buy their like raw numbers about they have a huge economy, so nothing else matters. Secondly, we'd say that tourism still helps Brazil's economy, and it's regulated through the government. And three, Brazil is in a unique position where they aren't bullyable by China because of their global standing. Fourth, China is better suited to help them in manufacturing anyways than the United States because that is what their economy is based on. And then on this free trade analysis, we think that you can participate in China's economy as well as the US because China is extremely connected to the world economy. Now, on this third contention about their logic about a crush, like they give you this example of the Cold War. This is a terrible example because look how badly that worked out for the United States when they fear-mongered everyone. Look how many people the US lost in Vietnam. Like they've learned somewhat from blind military intervention. Does the US choose to stick? I would argue no. India, East Germany, Ethiopia, these are all examples of this. They assert this point with no warranting. For all these reasons, I strongly urge a government ballot.
Awesome. Is everybody ready? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, everyone's ready. And if anyone isn't ready, speak now or hold your peace. Okay. Time begins now. I'm going to begin on the top of case, then move to op case, then move to gov case. Firstly, on the top of case, there's a bunch of things Gov team tells you. They tell you that, oh, we're just looking at some specific things, how China is the #2 power. But look, you literally said yourself in the first speech that the US is a global hegemon. You literally said this in the first speech. And then, so the question is, which is it? The good news is, for us, the things we picked weren't just random specific things. The things we picked were how strong is your economy? You think the US is massively bigger than China. It's not even close. And how strong is your military? It's 6 times stronger. What are these other factors? They tell you there's this like mystical tide where the countries perceive the China as greater than the US. This is just wrong. Countries go for what's best in their economic and military best interests. There's not some mystical third factor. If the US has the best economy and the best military, then that is the thing. Secondly, they tell you that something has to change in Brazil. But I think, and they talk about crime. I think noticeably there's crime. Sure, yes, there is crime. But what Austin tells you is that having a good economy is one of the best ways to fight against crime. Firstly, they don't respond to this. And secondly, is the fact that like, in general, yes, crime is bad, but like helping people economically, helping everyone economically is always going to be more important, especially as I'll get to later, why saying tourism is good is not the same thing as we should prioritize. What my opponents are saying is not tourism is good, but rather we should prioritize tourism over everything else, which is insane considering the fact that Brazil has a manufacturing economy. On this last thing they tell you about how China's going to be better for manufacturing, I'll get to that momentarily when I talk about economics. Now, on our first contention about economics, they first talk about loans and infrastructure. They say that this is just false because the G7 is also predatory. But and then they also say that like China won't be predatory because Brazil can push them around. But They drop our actual underlying analysis to this, judges. Austin tells you this. There is never actually a response to this, which is the fact that the US has an incentive for long-term analysis, investment, whereas China wants to take risks to deserve the status quo. China isn't interested in long-term investment. So in the best case scenario where Brazil can fight back against China, then China just won't offer a loan at all. China isn't interested in long-term investment. They don't respond to this. Don't let them make a new response in the PMR. Where the US is interested in long-term investment. Because they control the status quo, they're interested in making sure that like all of their people who are their allies will still be doing well 10, 20 years from now. Once again, no response to this. Don't let them make a new response in the PMR. Fundamentally, Brazil can still absolutely be harmed by China, and the best case scenario for Gov is that China doesn't offer Brazil any money at all. Then, secondly, on free trade, they say that China is more likely to help with manufacturing because they have lots of manufacturing. But that's not the point. The point, you don't need to like go to China for the like mystical manufacturing wizard who will tell you how like all manufacturing works. How much you do it isn't the point. The point is when you build infrastructure, US is much more capable of building infrastructure. And when you're trading with other nations, Ali never responds to the fact that fundamentally, the China has an incentive because it's number 2 and trying to push to number 1 to make countries personally reliant on solely China, where because the US controls the global climate and the status quo, the US wants to open up nations to the rest of the world. China might do more manufacturing than the US, but the rest of the world combined does a whole lot more manufacturing than China. Ali once again doesn't respond to this. Don't let them make any response to this in the PMR. It's really simple. The US wants to have long-term investment and wants to make sure nations are as open as possible to the global climate because the US is the ones controlling that global climate. China wants to take short-term risks to disturb that climate and make sure countries are only reliant on itself so that way it has a chance of disturbing the US in the future. Now, moving on to our second argument about geopolitics, they say that op is the status quo, but I think notably, first, literally the U.S. and the U.S. and like the Europe more broadly have fairly good relationships with Brazil. They do trade with Brazil. I think this idea that the status quo, nothing is happening, is bad. But secondly, look to this analysis, and this is also about the Gov third contention here about competition that Austin says, and once again, Ali doesn't respond to it. Don't let them make a new response in the PMR, which is about the deterrent effect, which is the fact that when the US, when one of the US's allies goes and partners with China, what the US doesn't do is go, hey, can we give you some more candy than they did? Will you come back to us? The US wants to make a point. It wants to show its other allies that if you go with China, bad things will happen to you. If they get a reputation for bribing countries back when they go over to China, then all of their allies will just put the US in a bidding war with China. Instead, what the US just has to do is the US puts the foot down. The US puts in trade blockades. They make sure that your life is going to be absolutely hell if you go with China. That's in the US best incentive. The US has no incentive to try to like be nice and win you back over. Then, secondly, they tell you that if countries are threatened by China, then they won't harm Brazil. The logic of this is pretty obvious. It makes sense that if countries are like feel threatened by a nation, then they'll do what that nation wants and they're not going to go after that nation's allies. The problem is that if it ever push comes to shove, countries are way more scared of the US than China. Everything they tell you about how countries like won't do this because they're scared of China is wrong, because all of those countries are hostile to China precisely because they're even more scared of the US. Yes, countries act out of fear, but all of the incentives flow towards the US, not towards China. Third contention on military. They say, look at the Taliban. US interventions turn out badly because they fly in blind. But no, the example Ali gives look bad for the US because in those examples, they aren't supporting a pre-existing military, but rather sending in troops like to immediately stuff of their own when there's not a lot there already. Look at Ukraine instead, where the US has saved a huge amount, like has helped a ton from being destroyed by Russia. Ukraine helps a huge amount because Ukraine already is in the same situation as Brazil, where Brazil already does have a military. It already does have some amount of economy. Obviously, the US is bigger than Ukraine. The US is bigger than Brazil, but the US isn't going somewhere where there's nothing. There is infrastructure, there is a military, and the US is really well equipped to support them. Now, moving on to gov case. I spent more time on op case because, frankly, a lot of the responses to gov case were just cross applications of the responses to op case. So, gov case, they first tell you that tough on crime in the US is different from what El Salvador is doing. But I think notably, relationships aren't about sending aid, it's really about economic policy. And notably, neither the US or China care about the crime rate in Brazil. Neither country is getting worked up about crime in Brazil. What both countries care about is how much money are we getting back. When Brazil trades back with us, how much money is there going to be? And what that means is that both countries are going to be totally fine with crackdowns on crime. Like, yeah, Bukele is very popular in the US. There's not really a way for us to verify which is the truth in this round. But notably, no matter what happens with Bukele, nobody is out there saying the US should stop trading with El Salvador. Because fundamentally, if El Salvador had lots of money, the US would trade with them regardless. Neither country cares about crime rate. What both countries care about is what the economy of Brazil is. Look to our dropped analysis about why the US always has better incentives for Brazil to do better in the long run than China. China also doesn't have the ability to help them in the case of a military conflict because their military is 7 times smaller than the US's. Okay, second gov contention here is on the economic boon. They say that economic stability is as important as GDP, but GDP is literally a representation of how well your economy is doing. It's a representation of stability. There's no like mystical math where you go like, aha, the economy is stable now. No, like how strong your GDP is really good. And also Austin explains to you that while there is crime, the manufacturing economy in Brazil is really, really stable because they're doing so well in the world, and especially in the fields of like automobile and airplane manufacturing. What that means is that when you're picking between China and the US, even if you buy what they tell you about China cracking down on crime for some reason and tourism being good, you always would rather go with the US and open up to the rest of the world where you make your manufacturing economy better and bigger. The question of this round is not, is tourism good, but which is more important for Brazil? And they literally concede the fact, because it's just true, that tourism is not the big cause of economic growth in Brazil, it's manufacturing. Lastly, on this idea about competition, they say that the Cold War is a terrible example. But I think notably first, we won the Cold War, and yes, there were a lot of costs to the US, but also the general narratives in the US about the Cold War like still exist. We're not going to, and also the deterrent analysis, we're never going to just like let countries get away with allying with our biggest enemy. Thus, I urge an opposition ballot.
Okay. Oh, sorry, volume again. Okay. Is everybody ready? All right, my time begins now. Judges, Gov gives 3 contentions, which means that there's 3 essential questions that we need to ask to see who's winning the round, and unfortunately, all 3 of them point towards op winning the round. The first question is on who is better suited to help Brazil's economy. The answer is quite clearly the United States. Why is this the case? The primary reason is because of the completely dropped incentive analysis that me and Sam give you, which is that because the United States is the #1 economy in the world, which Gov agreed to multiple times by calling US the global hegemon, what that means is that the US has an incentive to open people up, bring them into the global economy because they run the global economy, and that they have an incentive to invest in countries long term, whereas China wants to take risks short term to disturb what's happening in the status quo. This incentive analysis is completely dropped by Gov, and it shows you very clearly that the US is going to be much better suited to help Brazil in the long term. Their only response as well to our other part of this contention, when we explain to you comparatively that China, because of their Belt and Road Initiative, is very predatory and very likely to abuse people. What was their response? They said that China isn't going to be able to abuse Brazil because, Brazil is a really strong economy. But the really key difference that Sam points out and that I point out in my case is that the United States' G7 won't even try to abuse you because they never actually respond to the fact that fundamentally China's main goal, because of the incentive analysis that we talk about, is to take short-term risks, make a lot of money back in the short term without caring about the long-term relationship that they develop with countries. Even if you buy that China won't be able to abuse Brazil that much, you still prefer the United States because, as we've shown you clearly, the United States isn't even going to try to abuse Brazil, which is obviously going to be better. Then we can also look at their other line of response here, which is that China is more into manufacturing, so they are more aligned with Brazil's economy. This, again, doesn't actually make any sense. As we explained to you, the United States still wants to invest in Brazilian manufacturing so they can get the benefits of it because Brazil is so powerful in manufacturing. All of this is really, really clear. The United States is more likely to give good loans and open Brazil up to the free trading economy, which is super important because they're a manufacturing economy that needs to be globalized to make money. Basically, all of this was dropped. The second question of the round is helping the economy more important than stopping crime? Now, first of all, as Sam showed you clearly in his speech, no matter who you pick here, the amount that crime goes down isn't going to change at all. But I want to imagine that you didn't buy that and give you weighing to explain why helping the economy on op side is more important than stopping crime on gov side. The first point is that both sides have agreed that probably the best way to stop crime is to make your economy better. This is why the richest countries in the world have really low crime rates and the poorest countries in the world have really high crime rates. Second is on scope. We think that more people are affected by a bad economy than crime. Only a small percentage of people, even in the most crime-ridden countries, are victims of crime, but every single person in a poor country is going to be poor and a victim of that economy. And third is on like an arguable magnitude point here, which is just the fact that like being poor and in desolate poverty is really, really bad, and having a good economy is really, really good. We think that even if somehow economy came at the cost of crime, which it absolutely never would, you would still prefer the economy. But third is on the question of, is the United States going to care more about Brazil if Brazil prioritizes China instead of the US? And that question sounds so ridiculous because obviously they won't, but in this debate, it still needs answering, because the key analysis that we gave you is that the United States is not just going to allow Brazil to walk all over them and say, we're going to go to China and you're going to have to give us all of your candy. When they respond in their MG speech by saying the Cold War is a terrible example, that's not actually a response to the warning that we give here, which means that fundamentally this is dropped. What we explained to you is the fact that the United States wants to make sure that there is a strong deterrent effect against allying with China to stop other countries from working with China and putting them in these kinds of bidding wars. Their response that the Cold War is, quote, a bad example is both not true, because the Cold War was a great example, as Sam explained, but it's also not an actual response to the underlying warning that we gave here, which means that on all three of the most key questions here, who is better suited to help Brazil's economy? The United States. That flows off. Is helping the economy more important than stopping crime? No, the economy is more important. That flows off. And is the United States going to care more about Brazil if Brazil prioritizes China? The answer is no, and that flows off as well. Insofar as those three questions answer the overall question of the round, which is, do any of Gov's contentions provide them a path to the ballot, with a clear answer of no, it could not be clearer that you should be voting for op in this debate. Thank you.
I'm unmuted. Sorry. I was muted. Okay. Great. If everybody is ready, then my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. The opposition never actually responds to the very first thing that we say in this debate, which is that something has got to give. And I think that we should go back to that. Because if you stick with the status quo, if you are stagnant, if you cannot make any progress, Brazil never gets better. With that, what are we looking at in this debate? Firstly, a clarification of what we think that you're evaluating the round under, kind of like framework-ish, but it's not really that important. Then a few refutations and a little bit of weighing. Let's talk about the framework, or overall, what we think you're going to consider when you talk about this round. Now, we tell you that you want to consider who can make Brazil safer. And basically, the opposition just comes up here and says that, like, the economy matters more because a better economy means a safer country. But the underlying analysis about that is because we prefer the economy because it gives us safety. So we think in the end, you're still preferring safety in either world. We still think that safety is the most important thing. And Ollie reads this to you, we don't get a real response. So we think that you're going to be looking at what world can make Brazil safer. But on that note, we think you can also consider the economy, and we would still win that. Let's talk about some refutations. Firstly, we'll concede that the US is the current global hegemon. Sure, but two things. Firstly, Ollie reads to you that China has passed the US for the first time in economic and diplomatic approval ratings, which means that China now is looking to the long term because they are edging to the top. They are closer to becoming the global hegemon. They don't respond. They just say that the US is the current global hegemon, but that doesn't interact with what Ollie tells you. We think that this whole incentive analysis about China only looking to the short term is fundamentally false insofar as China is now very close to becoming the top hegemonic power. And if they're about to POO this, they can't because it's incentive analysis that Ollie reads you from his second speech.
Yeah, we're calling. Sure.
We think this is new. We've been reading this incentive analysis since the first speech. You had plenty of time to respond to this in the MG, but there wasn't.
Yeah, Ollie says this in his MG where he says that China has just passed the US in global approval rating for the highest in the world. He says this means that like we have to consider what's going to happen in the future, and I'm extending this as well. It's like actually the first thing that he says in his speech.
Totally unrelated to the actual incentive. Extension of that point that like because China is going to pass the US, that upsets the incentive structure is absolutely new, and I think you know that.
Judge's discretion.
Judge's discretion, we think it's like an extension. We think it's pretty clear also something that Ollie reads is that this is part of the incentive, but up to the judges. Yeah, I also was going to say that we don't think this matters. That was going to be my next sentence. But okay, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. So we think their incentive analysis is wrong, but to that point, we don't think it even matters. What's the second thing here that they kind of just disregard? They drop our climate analysis on manufacturing, on the economy, which means that they concede that China is more likely to send more aid for infrastructure and for manufacturing than the US because they just care less about the climate, which means that if you are Brazil, you are statistically more likely to be getting economic infrastructural aid in a government world. That is clean conceded by the opposition. It doesn't matter, therefore, what we think they expect in the long term, because when that infrastructure is in place, we think Brazil's economy improves in the short term, whereas in the long term, we don't think anything is happening at all inside government. But also, we think that they also kind of drop the analysis that Ollie reads about how Brazil is in a unique position where they aren't as bullyable by China, which means that they're not actually going to be falling into this predatory debt trapping as much. We think that any aid that they get helps them. We think they get no aid on-site opposition. But now let's talk weighing. Let's talk short-term versus long-term. Opposition is the status quo, and we tell you this. And Brazil has a good economy by ops logic. Maybe we don't think that's entirely true. They have a large economy though, but they still have crime. And yet in the status quo, crime gets worse in Brazil and we don't see any economic change. Their world is actually devolving and they have no solvency to the point where we tell you they're not getting aid, or at least we are getting more aid. We don't think it matters because we think in both the short term and the long term, they have no impacts. If at least we have any impacts in the short term, you're still voting op, and we tell you that that's going to happen because China is more likely to engage. So then, let's talk about the long run, and this falls under several portions. But firstly, let's talk economics. They give this whole incentive analysis, but we give one too. So which one are you buying? The op says that the US is interested in long-term investment because they control the status quo. And the Gov says that China has an incentive to buy into countries because they aren't currently the global hegemon. So let's consider op's incentive analysis. They say that the US does care about long-term investment for some countries, but we tell you that this comes at a price because we tell you that they care way less about each individual country because they are a global hegemon. And Ollie reads this out to you in his speech, but what do? They don't respond. What does that mean? Gov's incentive analysis is a prerequisite to any help whatsoever, whereas on the op, the US might have some flimsy long-term investment, which we don't see any materialization of in the status quo, but that doesn't mean anything, because fundamentally, the US cares way less about each individual country. China needs Brazil to succeed, and therefore China is way more likely to help Brazil. This is something we tell you time and time again that they don't respond to. We think in either world, you're way more likely to be getting aid on side government. You're always therefore going to be voting for side government because it's best for Brazil. But now on war. Neither side is sending in any troops, and I think they misconceive that, and Ollie reads it in his speech, but again, they don't respond. So who sends in help? Who sends in money? We think both sides do. But importantly, again, our incentive analysis means that China is way more likely to send more aid because they need allies, therefore they need Brazil. To the point at which you have two incentive analyses, but one is actually a prerequisite to the other, where we think that you need to be sending real aid in order to materialize impacts, and you're not getting aid in an opposition world, you're always voting for side government, because at least something is happening. It doesn't matter if nothing happens in the long term on side government, because nothing happens in the long term on op, and that's proven by the status quo. But at least in the short term on government, you are getting some buy-in from China. You are getting some buy-in from countries that are going to be able to give you aid. China is going to be able to help Brazil with the manufacturing because of that climate incentive analysis. We tell you this is going to lead to a better economy, but more importantly, we think this again leads to a crackdown on crime. For all these reasons, I couldn't be prouder to affirm.
I was last to submit. This ended up being a 2-1 for the opposition, Dalton GW. I can go first if the other judges want to. Okay, so I sort of ended up going with net benefits. I think both sides kind of talk about with the economy and safety, so I sort of look at both. I kind of start with what side gives more aid in general. So Gov tells me that because China's a manufacturing economy and doesn't care about the climate, Gov's going to give more aid. And then Op gives me all that like incentive analysis about how like the US is already the global hegemon. So for me, it doesn't really matter like how much material, like I don't really buy the idea that because China's a manufacturing economy, it's going to like necessarily be that good for Brazil if Brazil isn't trading. So I sort of end up going with Ops like free trade analysis if it's going to help Brazil actually like be integrated to the global economy. And then I probably buy that like China cares more about Brazil than the US would care about Brazil. But then I also buy Ops analysis about how the ways that the US are going to intervene and help are probably, or, sorry, the ways that China are going to like intervene are probably going to be bad. Like BRI is probably going to be worse than China's like, I mean, than the US is like G7. I sort of buy like the deterrent effect analysis from Op. I buy Ops C2 and 3. On crime, I sort of just buy that neither, like there's not going to be a delta on either side because neither China or the US really has an incentive to help. So for me, it all pretty much flows Op, and the things I have floating Gov are like the idea about how the like China's going to care more, but I sort of buy that, but at the same time, I don't think that the ways that they're going to intervene are going to be like particularly good for Brazil. So that was my RFD.
Okay, I can go next. I actually went with Gov. And what kind of came down to me was just like, I guess like the two incentives, right? Like I guess what is kind of gonna give um which country's gonna give like Brazil like more of like the aid. And I thought like that um idea that Gov brought up was like really creative about like the whole like climate change thing, like how they're actually going to care like more about like manufacturing that's gonna help. Gov, I actually bought that and I thought that was like more of an incentive for like China to help with the manufacturing to help this issue. And I kind of bought like it was better for like Gov to like I guess have a small impact than for on op side to have nothing. So I bought that idea. And that's basically why I went with Gov.
I guess I'll go next. So I went with Gov just because I feel like there's a big turning. I'm sorry, not Gov, Op. My bad. I misspoke. I went with Op because I feel like there was a big turning point with the kind of like safety versus economy, and I feel like that also kind of spun a lot of Gov's initial points with the contentions to weigh in for a little less, especially because the point about economy in the framework was kind of conceded. So I feel like that strengthened the opposition's points and took a little bit away from the government's points. I also feel like a lot of the historical examples the opposition gave were really clear. I mean, I'm also really big on history. I like it when you use examples. I'm a big believer in the phrase, if we do not learn our history, we're doomed to repeat it ourselves. So I feel like making those points and having really good like refutations and defense on those points like really help the opposition's argument.
Thank you.
Thank